I'm very, very happy to welcome Andy Domeier. Give it up for Andy.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So as Bridget mentioned, it's really important to me that I get some feedback today. This is a topic I'm really passionate about, and I think it's kind of fun to put together talks on things you're passionate about. Also, if you've ever been in a situation like this before when you're really passionate about something, it's really easy to get tunnel vision on what your perspectives of the ideas are and how you're thinking about the problem. And so, like I do every other meetup, this time in a slightly different capacity, I want to learn from all of you. I do that every time we have a meetup. I learn a ton. That's why we have these. That's why they're awesome. That's why it's fun to get together. And as Bridget said, I really want your honest feedback. I do think this is going to be slightly more nerve-wracking than Mononorama due to the amount of sport engine heckling right in the front row here. But I would like to point out to all of you at Sport Engine all of the awesome jobs that Nate pointed out earlier in the meetup. So just going to call that out. All right, so let's jump into it. If you want to heckle me on the Twitters, I'm right there. But let's just dive right into it here. So first and foremost, I'm a director at SPS Commerce. If you saw any code I've ever touched, you would laugh really hard thinking it's a joke. The team at SPS is awesome. We collaborate really well. We talk about ideas. We turn ideas into something really tangible, right? So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today took either a lot of people to put together, a lot of great conversations, willingness to collaborate, and just really talented engineers. So I wanted to get that out there first and foremost. This isn't stuff where I was sitting there hacking at this. This is a lot of people's work for things we've done. So what I want to jump into today is I want to talk a little bit about the landscape and align on definition, because I think that that's really important for this topic, and then just share a little bit about what SPS has done so far in this area. For starters, digital transformation. Like DevOps, I'm super sick of hearing that word. I don't know if you are, but it's real. So right now, technology is really seriously a competitive advantage. And when you look at things like velocity, velocity wins. If you ship fast and ship often, you're doing really well as an organization. If you don't, you're probably struggling. Now, to do that well, it's really critical for you to reduce the friction from getting an idea to production. That being said, performance wins as well too. So, Datadog being here, thank you very much for sponsoring tonight. It's critical to reduce risk and outperform your competitors, right? Well, a big reason for that is because it's super easy to fire a SaaS company. If you're frustrated or not happy with your service, you can leave really quickly. Well, the challenge there is that these things directly compete. How do you ship things? How do you change quickly? How do you do all of this stuff? But then how do you do it in a way that you're performing and meeting customer expectations and making sure your customers don't fire you? This is really hard. This is probably why a lot of us are in this room tonight. So if we step back and kind of look at value and velocity and valuing performance, there's some really, kind of cliche words or niche words in the market right now. You're probably looking at microservice architectures if you value velocity. You're likely looking at cloud service providers. You probably have some sort of CI/CD pipeline. You're likely running some sort of platform to reduce the amount of non-differentiating work that your engineering teams have to do to ship some ideas. In combination with that, if you're valuing performance, you've probably invested in monitoring and observability tools. You probably have change management, processes in place. You probably have good incident management process in place. And you likely are really good at continuous improvement. You're probably looking at your problems and improving from them. Maybe you're doing chaos engineering, things like that. And I think when you look at all the friction of those two things, that's where you kind of see DevOps has started. These SRE teams are out there. You start to see people talk about autonomous service teams that have more focus and have more ownership over specific space. So if we look at what that means to enable velocity, really what's happening is your complexity is increasing a lot. Your change rates are higher than ever. If you compare the change rates in any technology organization that's successful right now, it's absolutely higher than it was for companies that were successful 8 years ago. Your SaaS tools are probably business critical, whether it's GitHub or some sort of a monitoring and alerting tools. Microservices are really great for agility, so you're probably looking at something like that. And your business depends really highly on third parties, whether you're in the cloud, using CDN for something else, things like that. Meanwhile, you probably have some legacy systems and technical debt that are probably generating enough revenue to not turn it off, unless, did I miss a memo on that? I was really hoping I did. No, there's still a thing. Okay, technical debt is still a thing. Got it. So when you look at that landscape, something that I think is really interesting to stop and reflect on is the fact that complexity in our environments stresses the need for all of us to have more context. So like stepping back and taking the simple, let's Google context and see what happens. The circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. If you spend some time, so I italicized fully there because there's some caveats to that later, but if you spend some time looking at how can you be effective with context, there's two real common themes that come out of that. You ask the right questions, and you create a culture of curiosity. Those are things that are really common when you're really effective with context. So what does that mean for technologists? Well, probably ask questions oftentimes like, why is this happening? What changed? Why did it change? What are my dependencies? Why does this thing even exist? What is this old Windows machine still running for? Things like that, right? And so I think that as we get into this further, because I'm so passionate about this subject, I wanted to spare no expenses on a really high-res graphic to talk through this with you. So my thought on this problem and what I'd like to challenge us all to think a bit deeper about and talk through is the idea that as complexity increases in our organization and in our technology stacks, our context, the amount of available context is increasing as well, which means that we have to start thinking differently about what are the types of things we need to know to do our job well. So I want to talk through a little bit of what might fill context, what might fill complexity. They're the really obvious ones. Things like monitoring, things like observability data, whether it's metrics or distributed tracing, or you have centralized logging that you're using effectively, or even incident management process. What are some things that happened on these services recently? How can I learn from them? Then you have other basic concepts like documentation. There's context in documentation. There's really interesting data in there if somebody took the time to write it. There's a really great process that's in the industry right now called operational readiness that I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then there are things like change management. Why did this thing change? Who changed it? What service was it that changed? Why? How? Like, what were the details inside that change? Performance reporting. How does this thing typically operate? Is this pretty typical for what I would expect the service to be doing? And probably the most important contributor to context are people. Think about how many people in this room right now know something about a system in your stack that only one or two other people know, and you know it's not documented. The entire room, right? And I'm totally in that. Yeah, Josh, you're like, yeah, it's your first day. It's Josh's first day, and he can say that. Like, absolutely, people are the most important part of this. But like, we can't forget that I'll talk about it a little later, but that really stresses how effective and how important communication is in an organization. So then when you think about complexity in a tech space, we don't need to spend a ton of time on this. Architecture matters a ton. You might be a monolith. You might be microservices. There's pros and cons to those. You might be in a cloud. You might be highly dependent on other third-party services. Maybe you can't scale if GitHub's down. That's a big deal. You might be running things inside Docker. If you are, you might be orchestrating it with Kubernetes or something like that. Service meshes are really cool, so you should probably run those maybe if you don't like to use DNS. Org structure matters significantly, right? Like, how complicated is it for you to get anything done? When you do send a change ticket in, do you have to go talk to somebody 2 floors away that you don't even know? That's kind of weird, but maybe that's how you have to get things done. The rate of change in your organization, how fast are things changing? What do those interdependencies look like? Everyone has technical debt. There is that old server somewhere running, generating revenue. It does matter. We need to keep it running. But that's things that we need to know about, right? And as Bridget was talking about earlier, I think we can all agree one of the most complex things, and a shout out to the person behind the screen here, Tad, and Joe, who can't be here tonight, AV has got to be the hardest thing ever, right? It's never the right microphone when you plug in. Nothing ever works when it's supposed to.
It does here.
Thank you, Tad. You're darn right it does here. Tad is amazing. But, like, whoa, all right? This is a lot of stuff. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to make sense of. And so one of the things I think is important when we look at all of this at a kind of a more macro level is it seems more obvious now that the efficiency of an organization can really directly be correlated to how effective you are with your available context. How good are you with the context you have, not just as an individual, which sometimes I think sets really effective engineers apart from others, but as a team, as an organization. What are you doing to work with each other, collaborate, share data in a meaningful way that helps everybody around you be more effective? So the goal here is to make the right context available, right? So I want to talk through how I look at this problem and talk a little bit about what SPS has done to tackle it. So first and foremost, I think when we look at what might you be doing to kind of fill up that context side of things in terms of how much complexity you have, first and foremost is the people. There are so many aspects of this that play into how effective you can be as an organization, what you know, who you need to talk to. This obviously gets more challenging. I think where you see this gap increase is the complexity of your organization is going to create this gap a lot of times for the amount of available context you have versus how many people can cover it. And when I found that context definition online earlier, I had pinged John Alsbach because it felt really similar to, wow, context and root cause and how much root cause isn't a thing anymore felt really in alignment. So I wanted John's perspective, and I was blown away by John's response. So he said fully, because I italicized fully in the definition, is problematic because context is constructed from perspective. And the reason why I was probing him, that blew me away, because when you think about that, okay, context is constructed from perspective, which means so far, 11 slides into this talk, everybody in this room probably has different context of my talk itself. This is just a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. What does that mean for a complex system? Maybe it's microservices running in the cloud. The amount of importance that's placed on people and our ability to communicate is astronomical. How effectively we do that matters a great deal. The next layer I look at as something that's much more predefined. There's metrics and thresholds, whether it's, hey, I know this service is down, I know the error rate is high, these are things that I want to respond to. It's really the basic monitoring aspects of things. It could be business metrics, could be things like revenue, sales quotas, it could be things like the service is up or the service is down. This is table stakes, I think, for a lot of folks in this room. A lot of times you probably have more of this than you think is reasonable because it was easier to push a predefined thing that you believed was going to be a problem than maybe the right thing. The next part, and this is the part that I think is really interesting in our space as system gets more complex, is this observability layer. And this is really the layer where you maybe haven't defined necessarily metrics that you want to be responding to, but this is all the data, all of the information that helps you actually assess something about the environment. It lets people be inquisitive, lets you use intuition, lets you figure out how can I approach this problem that we're thinking about and do it in a meaningful way. And then the last part, random, obscure, really hard things to find. I would argue there's always going to be a chunk of context that's just not worth your time. Like the S3 status page says it's up. I don't know why it says it's up. S3's down. I don't care, right? Oh, because S3 status page depends on S3. Weird. That's obscure and hard to find, and I'm just going to trust my systems when they're telling me S3 is down because I saw it in the logs. I don't need to identify that context ahead of time. So this is kind of framing up, you know, what I'm thinking the environment looks like right now, where I think we all can think a bit more about the different aspects of our environment, what we're doing. Just really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the SPS journey because I think that this helps lay the groundwork for what we've been through here in terms of growth. Really quickly, we're the largest retail supply chain communications network, which means orders, invoicing, shipping information, how you bought this thing on Amazon and it actually got to your door. A lot of that communication travels through our system and gets translated into different data formats in a way that people don't have to sit there and enter everything on a computer every day. We've had a lot of years of crazy growth. So I started with SPS in 2005. I was somewhere like employee number 85. We're at like 1,200 now. We're globally distributed tech team. Things have been growing really quickly. We've lifted a lot of stuff to the cloud. We've gone from monoliths to microservices. We've been pushing really hard towards autonomous service teams, which has been really fun. The amount of deployments we have in our environment are really high, and we have a really talented technology team. So just kind of setting the groundwork for these are growth challenges we've been through here at SPS that I think have set us up for some of the things that we've tackled. So first of all, when we look at things in terms of context, some ideas we've had, and there's some folks in the room here that have worked on some of these projects with us, is just this idea that there's a lot of events in our environment that generate context for people, but we have to apply some business logic to them to make them relevant for everybody. So an example is key stakeholder system health. If you operate in an environment where you have autonomous service teams or a larger organization where you maybe have 10 to 12 different product engineering environments, not every single team wants to see every single incident. They want to see the incidents about their services because that's actionable. If you send every single incident their way, it's going to be spam, and they're going to ignore it, and they should, because that would be annoying, especially if you're a high-performing service team. Standard operating procedures. I don't know many companies that don't have a lot of things that you could still just document and respond to. This thing's going to happen. We're not going to fix it. This is how we recover from it. Who the heck changed this thing just the other day or the last hour, and what was that change, and why are the systems being weird now? What recent changes have happened? And then service dependencies. As you get into microservices, there's a whole lot of weird interdependencies that start to play into how do you respond to this thing isn't healthy anymore. So I just want to talk through some of the basic ideas of how SPS has tackled these problems. And I'm happy to talk more about some of these ideas later. But first and foremost, we'll talk about this function that's called the router function. So we do incident management and change management in Jira, which at first many of you are like, why? It actually works really great. It actually does. If you disagree with me, Nate, I will love to show you other systems and how they look. But what we did is we built a webhook into our incident management and change management workflows inside Jira that would fire a webhook and trigger a Lambda function, and Lambda would publish that information onto an SNS topic. Now what that lets us do is that lets us subscribe some other application on the backside to fire other events based on that. So now we're in a position where anybody with some thought on how they could add value to an incident or change event could just go write a Lambda function, deploy it, and respond to those events as well. So some of the basic things we did with it, the first one was communication. So I was talking a little bit before about how do you get that context to the people that are interested. So for sure, this isn't like VictorOps PagerDuty type communication, right? This isn't some alert going off. This is, hey, your site was down for a couple minutes, right? That's a big deal. It wasn't your CPU is high. So this is a different layer of communication. I think it's important to understand that. This is something that like the CTO wants to understand the site was down. How many people in this room are on an on-call rotation where at some point during an outage, they just know they're supposed to call somebody else? Like, oh, my manager or my director should probably know about this problem. Does anyone have a scenario where the system at some point, if the site is down for a half an hour, will automatically call people above the people on call just because it knows how? Right.
Our system automatically does.
Well, okay. Sports Engine maybe has figured some of those things out. See, okay. Well, so I would argue that that's this context, right? Like there's information. I think that's such a great example. Like there's information in the heat of the moment when the systems are down and your engineers are online for the first 5 minutes trying to respond to it. The last thing you want them to do is pick up the phone and call somebody else. You want them working on the problem, right? But how do we make sure that communication is efficient and is getting to the right people? And that's really what this was all about, was saying, okay, when we know of a larger incident, who are the people that care about it? How do we let them know? And make sure that, in this case, the context a lot of times is email. This thing had a blip in the night. Great. Like, there's a lot that a VP or some manager or some engineer that's not on call that night can gain from knowing that went down. Because it's super easy as an engineer who's not on call to not even know about this thing that happened last night. So making sure that context is pushed is great. And then additionally, maybe you have a team chat room. What chat should that bounce into? It shouldn't bounce into everybody's rooms. but specific ones. Additionally, changes is a really interesting event to care about, particularly in incidents. So something that we looked at there was, hey, as we're going down this path of microservices, there's a lot of interdependencies, and if you change your service and I haven't changed mine, but suddenly mine's having a health issue, how am I made aware of that in a way that's effective when you're shipping 200 changes to production a day? So this function's all subscribed to the exact same SNS topic, and all it's doing here is saying, okay, I have an incident, so it's using two different functions. The first one is this search, so it goes back and searches change management and says, do I have any recent changes for this service that's having an incident? If I do, it uses the next function, the commenter, and comments back to the incident. It says, by the way, this service had a change about 2 hours ago. Nate deployed a change. He probably broke something. I love pointing the finger at Nate when I can. But this opens us up to this ecosystem where there's no reason why, if we found value in it, we couldn't call that from chat too. It'd be really nice in chat to say, well, okay, this incident's for this service, but this service over here seems like it's the problem. Can I just call from chat any recent changes from that service? Being able to do that consistently would be really nice. And then another one, standard operating procedures. So we have a level 1 team in India who does a great job of helping our engineers sleep. They're really fantastic. But part of the flow for them is they need to understand what's okay for them to do and not to do sometimes. And so we have standard operating procedures that are pretty basic that help them understand the steps they could take in different scenarios. And so that takes like searching a wiki from India Internet isn't the fastest thing in the world. And so what we've done here is when the alert triggers, we built a router that puts our alerts on an SNS topic, and then we have functions listening to that basically query our wiki and say, hey, if you were going to query the wiki for this type of problem, what articles would you find? And then it drops those URLs using this commenter right back into the alerts, so that when an engineer is responding to the alert or opens it up, they have a list of URLs that might make sense for them to look at first, saving a few minutes, which I think, as some of you know, when you're responding to alerts on call, a few minutes matters a great deal. Part of what I really like about this one, we haven't taken this further yet, but this has completely opened the door. Like, anybody could write any automation they want to that alerts queue. You could write some sort of interesting information about open incidents. You could post recent changes back into this. You could ask if S3 is up. You could do a lot of different things just with an idea. And some of those things could be 30 lines of Python code. They don't have to be complicated. And you can instantly push context or information to people that can be really interesting. The last one that I'm really excited about, I think we're going to be able to do a lot more with this as we grow it, is this idea of dependencies. So what we've done here, again, using that same router function, when an incident or change happens, there's an SNS topic, and a function on the backside of that listening to that, trying to understand, hey, this service 123, has an incident. Okay, well, what is it dependent on? Because if I'm an engineer responding to this, maybe I'm not familiar with all of these dependencies. We have 200 production microservices happening right now, so what are all of them that I need to care about? I probably don't know offhand. But additionally, what are things dependent on me? If I'm having a health issue, do we have some end customer product that might be affected? Are there going to be customers calling in? How do you map this random service API that's buried in your microservice architecture back to customer experience? So this allows us to start thinking about it and asking those questions in a way that we can look up some of that dependency information and post it back into an incident ticket. What's been really fun is in a change ticket, you're going to change this thing. Please recognize these are who you're dependent on, or these are people that might be affected by your change because they're dependent on you. And that commenter function is the same one you saw earlier. So we're reusing some of these functions, kind of basic microservices concepts. So that's some of the automation and some of the push work that we've done so far that I think is in an interesting way. I'll talk about operational readiness in a little bit, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. I did want to talk a little bit about how visualization brings context. And so this is a graph I look at all the time. This is probably the most important graph we have at SPS Commerce. It's representing basically canary documents flowing through the system that test a lot of different paths and a lot of different workflows and show us our processing times. So if these were ever to spike, there's probably something going on. So I kind of comment here, mind your intentions, because I think the evolution of this has been really interesting for us. So back when we were a monolith, we had one or two really common problems. And when these alerts would start to cross this alert threshold, this is when people get paged, it was really obvious typically what the problem was. As we progressed towards microservices, it was less obvious. And now, this is the worst alert you could get as an engineer or myself as a manager. If I get paged in the middle of the night because this is going over, it could be one of 5,000 things. Like 2 a.m., hey, one out of 5,000 things is broken. Giddy up, have fun. So intentions when this started was great. It was really manageable. And it's still really important. But the function of it, the context behind it is so much different than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago for us. I think this is a really interesting time to stop and look at this graph. Does anybody know what this graph is? Got a few folks in here. All right. So this is a really, really interesting graphical representation of Napoleon's march on Moscow in 1812, I believe it was. And this is world-renowned as something that is just, it's a graphical representation that is just loaded with data. So obviously you can't read, I believe it's French, but, or maybe you can, I shouldn't assume. But I think some of the things that are really interesting when you think about the amount of context that can come out of this graph, just to walk you through it, so this is basically the distance between where Napoleon started in Moscow, and the width of the line represents the number of troops that he had. Additionally, you see distance marked within it. One of the huge problems that Napoleon's army hit on their return was it was winter. So direction is represented here. So tan is one way, black is back the other way, right? So on the way back, you can see some of these temperatures represented here. And you can see like when the temperature hits, how the number of soldiers typically decrease, or when you have to cross a river in the winter, it's kind of tricky. But I think this is a really, if we were able to take the graph that I just showed you and layer in more context, this is an example of that. Like the amount of data in this image is really, really powerful, really interesting. And from 1812, like it's still a really popular, if you follow, so our CTO loves Edward Tufte, great in terms of like visual representation of data. And these are really interesting concepts. So here's where I'm gonna brave the demo gods a little bit and jump into our dev environment. Shout out to my friend Mike in the crowd here who helped me get the demo environment ready so that it didn't actually show production, SPS production data. But this is something we had worked on, very similar. So if you think about that problem I was talking about before where those tests represent lots of different services and the impact of that, what we were trying to do is figure out different ways to better show our system, better show the document flow through our system. And Netflix open sourced a project called Visceral. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty interesting. But really it's basic in terms of what it does. It just visualizes this JSON metrics data. So a couple of folks at SPS got together, built this really cool app they called the Observatory. And basically we pointed at our logs. So we said, hey, we got a bunch of people who know how to query our logs really well. So let's write and define a bunch of metrics in our logs that the Observatory can use and display in Visceral. So that's what this is going to be a representation of, if I don't screw it up. So I renamed a lot of the apps in here today. So like you can see Buffy is exchanging data with Angel and Spike. I'm really sad Joe's not here because I did add Babylon 5 for Joe. But I just wanted to show like this is essentially a decent reflection of that line graph I showed earlier. And shout out to things like Servy mixed service space. I like to think here this is the Vikings passing out losses to the Packers and the Bears. And Bridget, I did I did say the Packers could hand out losses to the Browns. I feel like that's achievable for you this year. Like this is again a general idea where if you know the systems, if you know like this is legitimate production traffic from our logs at SPS Commerce right now. I just renamed the app so that you don't have some context to some of those things. But when you look at the different aspects of your environment, so for example, Mario is really stubborn and doesn't like to change a lot. But if Mario's having problems in our environment, that's a big problem. Mario is a really important part of our infrastructure, whereas if I'm looking at something maybe like Bart, it's a little more contained to just Maggie and Lisa. So there are a lot of different ways to visualize this data. I think the graph I was showing before and Tufty give us good things to think about in terms of how deep you need to go and what context you need to have. This isn't really useful without that other line graph I showed. That other line graph is really difficult to respond to without this, right? So all this context is really important, and it's something that has helped us quite a bit in terms of some of the things that we're trying to tackle. So I did have a lot of fun making up some service names, but I kind of ran out of creativity down the road. Air Supply was playing, so they became a node. I needed to calm down today. That's who I listened to. I'm just kidding. All right. So I'm going to fly through the last part here because we're running a bit long. Jumping into a few things around operational readiness. Susan Fowler, give her a ton of credit here. I caught her talk at Velocity. She's brilliant. Wrote a great book. She's talked about it a bit. We've been applying it here at SPS, and it's been really, really helpful. Essentially, it just gives you this base set of consistent values for how you want to deliver a service. And it lets you kind of structure what are the things you care about, how do you want to tackle them. What we've done at SPS is we've said if operational readiness is important, then it needs to be important over time. And so what we've done is we've taken some of the data out of readiness and started doing things like say, well, change rate's important, incident rate's important, things like that. And so we're logging how frequently our services change, what the success rate of those changes are, and things like that. So we're able to see, this service happens to be Nate's team who just left. 200%, they're deploying twice a day. That gives me a lot of confidence that they know what they're doing, and when it's time for them to do changes, I don't have to worry as much as this team or this service that only gets changed 1% of the time. And so that context is immediately valuable to me. I know how much confidence to have in that service and the change that's about to happen, or maybe our ability to recover from it if we don't touch it that often. This is some other ways we're looking at that data right now. Basically, we're saying, hey, now we're looking at all this stuff with a consistent set of values, so we can look at maybe one service versus another, and maybe this is an old legacy service that doesn't generate that much revenue. Guess what? It probably doesn't make sense to make it any better than what it is, whereas the green app might be like the new, latest, greatest production service that makes sense to keep there. So you now have some data behind some of those decisions and context to decide what the right thing for your organization is. So to wrap up, I think I just want to lay a couple questions out there to challenge everybody to make sure you're recognizing that you all have your own context. Everybody has their own perspective of the talk I just gave. You probably caught some things different than the person sitting immediately next to you. Everybody in here except the front row who all works at Sport Engine have a completely unique environment to your own environment. And so that plays into a lot of this. So as you're leaving today, I would just challenge you to all think about how can you help your organization be most effective with the context it has. Thank you.
Okay, I think that was fantastic, Andy.
Thank you.
And I have some questions myself, but we probably need to give the mic to Sport Engine so that they can heckle you back. So we'll start over here.
It's happening to me again. This literally is.
Did you see Waluigi was on the
Waluigi was on there. That was nice.
We want to watch that while we're asking questions.
I'm gonna refrain from asking you a bunch of visceral questions because I always have those. So we've talked about this before, but can you briefly touch on how you've operationalized operational readiness? Because I find that super awesome.
Yeah. So.
And tell us what operationalize
Yes, operationalize means actually doing it consistently, effectively, and then doing something with the data when you're done. So consistently means everybody in the organization should do it or care about it. I would say we're still in our infancy a little bit, but effectively what we've done that's going really well is we cared more about the definition than what you're doing with it. So when we got into operational readiness, there's security data, there's how do you change your environment, what's your disaster recovery plan, what's the service name that you operate in PagerDuty under, what are your key performance metrics, what are your test plans, where's your GitHub repo, all these things come out of that, right? And a lot of them don't change that often. So what we ended up finding was it ends up being about 2 hours of extra work for us to collect that data and then have a meeting to talk about it, which is completely worth it. Like when you're talking about a brand new service going to production, why not? What we want to keep improving is how we collect the data. So we're currently working on trying to put a UI in front of it. Right now, what we've done is we've iterated on just a really basic YAML file, because what's more important is the definition than where the definition is. It could be in a wiki, it could be in a YAML file, it could be anywhere else. But now that we've got a better definition for what SPS is using it for, we can put a database schema behind it, we can put a UI in front of it, and now we have that data and it's queryable, and we can do more interesting things like confidence reporting with it. So care about the definition. Don't get, and we're engineers, right? Everyone's going to say, well, your YAML's not syntactically valid, or why are you using YAML? JSON's way better. Why can't this just be in a wiki? So you have to really coach on, don't get hung up on that. We care about the definition of readiness. Uh-oh.
So I could, leading question, I guess. I could watch Visceral all day.
Mm-hmm.
That's open source. Is SPS Observability open source?
That is a leading question. We are working on trying to get a more effective open source office going. Turns out, as soon as you want to open source stuff, patent trolls watch you really closely. So you have to be really well organized around how you're doing those things. Absolutely, our aspirations are to open source Observatory, because one of the things that would be really cool, Datadog's here tonight, maybe they saw Observatory, and then they could add a Datadog plugin to Observatory, and now you could have your Datadog data in Visceral. We have other monitoring providers that we're trying to plug into this as well. And I think additionally, like the other automation functions we talked about are things that are like a couple of them, Jeremy wrote them, and a couple of them are like 38 lines of Python. They're just Lambda functions that are basic. Anyone could use the Jira commenter and Jira search functions. Just get your own access keys, right? So we definitely have aspirations where we want to open source a lot of that, because the community could benefit and make them so much better. So not yet, coming.
It's almost like Jeremy doesn't work there anymore, but still wants this.
Or he still wants to work here. One of the two.
Ooh. Okay, we'll see if anyone else has a question. But meanwhile, I have a slightly, perhaps, trollish question, which is, I noticed you had Jira in there.
Yeah.
I'm a little concerned about the Jira being a single point of failure. Can you address any remediation or plans for that?
That is an awesome question. We do not have really good plans for that, actually. I think one of the things that I like about this architecture of using functions as a service as opposed to something else is that ideally you open them up to make those calls from anywhere, right? So yeah, if incident management's down and doesn't trigger this thing where I would love to just know what recent changes happened on a service, let me call that from chat, right? We do have like protocol to do incident management outside of Jira, but for sure our dependencies right now aren't great in terms of locked into some of that automation triggering.
It's almost like I've been on call for sadness before.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sad servers right here.
Servers.
That's your server, Bridget.
Really?
Oh wait, something's there. There goes.
No. Sad servers right there. I'm pointing to bears.
Oh yes, we could pick on the bears together.
We got to pick on the bears together.
I agree with that.
I actually, and I'll put a note to you on Slack just so that you have it for referring to later. I want all of the text to be twice as big so that people can actually see all of the hilarious sports teams.
And if I didn't have to modify the source code, I would totally do that. That's not my wheelhouse. It took me long enough to think up things like Tailspin references and Buffy the Vampire references today. So, Tailspin, anybody? Watch that growing up, right?
Nice.
That was awesome.
All right, I think I have a question back here.
Sorry to make you walk all the way back here. All right. So one of the things that you mentioned was that in context, you have people. And I always view people as kind of the complexity. Really, like somebody knowing an individual thing is more complexity of something than it is the context. But if you're striving to visualize context, how do you visualize that internal knowledge that somebody has, or I guess pull them into that conversation right away?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I would say, kind of to touch on your first comment, the way that I've looked at that a bit, I agree with you. Like the communication and the people aspects of things are the hardest, but I think you could argue the same thing about monitoring data. Just because you are maybe emitting metrics about your app doesn't mean I know how to find them, right? That's no different than just because you know something about your app doesn't mean I know how to ask you for that data. So I look at that as like either your monitoring system or you have that information, and my ability to either retrieve it is limited or it's efficient, right? So like what I would challenge you to think about, or what I'd love to talk more about over a beer, is this idea of like, you know, like a lot of the automation you saw was, we know that this is relevant to somebody, let me push it to you. And then visceral is, this is complex and interesting, let me show it to you. Like you can come seek this out and you can know it's there. And I think you can think the same thing about documentation too. So I think that, you know, depending on what it is inside the people's brains that you're trying to get out, if it's consistent or common, like I would use this as an example, like the red metrics for request rates and error rates and things like that are consistent and common. So you can look at the entire organization and say, hey, let me create a space for you to put this information, and then the information you now have about the system is that much more effective. Because you might have a perspective about this, but in general, it's telling us all the exact same thing. So you get to control that structure once you get that out there. Does that make sense? Cool.
With, I guess it would be 1,199 coworkers, I liked your probing questions for gathering context, but have you considered a protocol, or do you have any experience with leading questions to understand the level of abstraction that people you're communicating with have about the system? Because I find that's often the limiting factor for sharing context in discussions.
Yeah, I think, so having been at SPS and getting from 80 to 1,200 people, I think what I've noticed, and why I scoffed at change management at the start, but like change management actually is in my org and I love it, is because like you recognize that structure, org complexity and other complexities in the environment stress the need for those things, right? It's how you do them and understanding your goal that make you efficient. And so I think it's maybe not like I don't mean this to be like the easiest way out, but I do think that there's an aspect of, and it touches on your question too, like if you can identify as an organization a larger contextual concept that everybody can share, then do it in the same way, whether it's operational readiness or some sort of observability. So we use a tool called Logic Monitor that everybody has to have a dashboard in Logic Monitor, and they all need to represent some level of request errors duration within it, right? So like those are just table stakes. Like we can apply that to everybody reasonably, and that's okay, and that helps us solve some of that scale. So I think the thing is like, yeah, there are systems where people might know like really deep nuanced stuff, but like you can still ask what your request and error rates are. That's not unreasonable. And you can still put it in the same place that everybody else's request and error rates are, and now everybody's speaking the same language and have that same context. Does that help? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Okay, I have another question. I could sit here and ask questions all day, but I won't. But I'm sitting here watching this hypnotic flow of data and thinking, what happens if I'm not aware of where to set thresholds? Because I don't really notice it started speeding up or slowing down someplace. Is there, like, do you have some place that you can write queries against this? Or, like, you know what I'm saying? You can't just watch a dashboard.
Absolutely.
You can't just watch blinking lights.
So we're still working on some of the structure there, but all of the data that's producing this is straight up request rate data from our logs, 100%. Like all of its log request rate data. So right now everything on here is default. If something were to stop working, So like, let's say that, let's pick something funny to talk about. Let's say that Waluigi stops talking to Mario because they're angry because he lost in Mario Kart. This stream, if it went to 0, would show a mark for now. But we do have the ability to set that custom threshold differently based on.
You can
based on that
alert off of
information.
it, or like, can you?
So
do something?
the alerting, since it is from our monitoring data, there still is the second level of alerting that you have to set. So yes, like you could for surely either mark a node in here unhealthy or a stream in here unhealthy, and that's separate from what you configured to page somebody.
I just want, like, Mario Kart problems paging people.
Oh,
That sounds
know.
hilarious.
That would be fun.
Okay, so I couldn't refrain that long. So, because I find Visceral like kind of fascinating, like in its concept, right? Like, so I think the interesting part, right, is that whenever Waluigi can't talk to Mario, that could affect Mario talking to Ray, or looks like Ray is talking to Mario. Mario talking to Luigi, right? So that's what's actually interesting from Visceral's perspective is like its ability to show you problems further down the chain, right? Like,
yeah,
understanding that dependency chain.
Yeah.
Have you guys found that like effective for it yet? Like, I'm just curious,
Yes.
like how many, like if that's a really common thing that you see.
Yeah, so actually, Bridget had the awesomest lead-in question there. So I think, for example, like if the sea duck from Tailspin were to be unhealthy, then ideally we are aware of that in a way that we can mark that node specifically unhealthy. And then the amount of information you suddenly glean from that when you see, maybe this stream and this stream don't have any data flow, and you see that's unhealthy, right? Or like, to your point, if this doesn't have data flow, maybe Luigi as a node is healthy, but it's Waluigi that's unhealthy, then this is actually way more fun than I was thinking using all these words. Then the node itself would represent, right? But like one of the things Bridget hit on is something that we have aspirations for, but maybe not enough capacity to tackle this year, which is if you could overlay what are the things that you want to alert somebody for with the same thing that's going to mark this health properly, then I think you have a really awesome situation.
I was wondering if you found any possible patterns that have revealed themselves and been able to mark any anomalies because those patterns aren't repeating themselves.
I think one of the more interesting things that we found, and Mike, one of the SREs in my team, is in the room tonight with me. We both, for like, it had to have been like a day and a half, we were both looking at, I want to say it was Ralph talking to Milhouse, if I remember my systems right. And the amount of like transactions flowing from Ralph to Milhouse far exceeded anything Maggie was sending Ralph, and anything Milhouse was sending Harry. And so it was just this really odd, like the request rate between those two was really high. And we stared at it for a long time. We looked at the queries, everything, metrics, request rate rise looked fine. And then after a while, the queuing infrastructure that Milhouse depends on started to act funny. And as we dug into it further, we found that we actually had a bunch of unhealthy requests. And so what we were seeing was retries being counted as request rate. And so that was an example where like no alerts were going off. All the systems, all the infrastructure was fine. Everything looked fine. Like maybe things were 10 seconds slower than normal, if that, which for transaction like data processing isn't really noticeable. And without this, we wouldn't have started there. We would have been like, oh, this queue's unhealthy. We'd restart the queue servers and make sure everything looks fine that way. And 2 days later, it would have been unhealthy again. So it was really interesting to see that. Did that answer what you were suggesting? Okay, cool. Yeah, and we've definitely had scenarios where, middle of the day, and we're sneaking a build in on Mario, and it's like everything hits the brakes, and you're like, everything up there is yellow right now. What's happening? And then Nate stands up and says, "It's all okay. This is expected."
So I don't think this is what this was designed for, but looking at this from a red team perspective, if somebody is interested in mapping out a network, what kind of access would one need in order to be, like, what data are you looking for in order to be able to map this out?
Totally. So what aligns directly with that? Actually, Ian, that's an awesome question.
Oh, and for people who aren't familiar with Red Team.
So Red Team is somebody in security that is coming to talk to me only when I want to hide. Typically. I actually don't know what the red acronym stands for, Ian. Do you?
Red team, blue team is like I think it maybe comes from military jargon. It's the red team are the bad actors, the people who are coming in from an offensive perspective, who are trying to attack you. Blue team would be the theoretically good actors, the people who are coming at it from a defensive perspective, trying to prevent the red team from attacking them.
Great. So I stick by my story. The blues, my friends. The reds, stay away. No. So really interestingly enough, with the way that we do a lot of our logging, Ian, there's been a lot of talk about just doing this with our VPC traffic, and it would actually be not a ton of work to just redeploy our current observatory stack and write metrics for all of our VPC flow and get the exact same like traffic pattern, error rates, request rate, all of that through that. So it would, honestly, it would just take centralized logging of your network data and something that takes that data and represents it into the JSON format that Visceral wants to see. We've absolutely played with that idea. And this is all document traffic. We've talked about doing the same thing for all of our web service calls, right? Because if you throw web service calls on here, like Mario is really like 18 levels of craziness. It's not just like one app, right? There's a bunch of microservices and databases and things behind that still.
So I'm sorry to keep getting hung up on your really cool visualization, but just looking at this, is there does it have capabilities to like replay past data over time? And have you found that valuable? Like, can you go back and replay data, fast forwarding and maybe pausing or keying up on points at which the status of something changed?
That's a great question. We literally had a what's next meeting about 2 weeks ago, and that was one of the top 3 ideas that we left with was it would be really interesting if we could replay this over the course of an incident and understand what the impact of that incident or change was on the system. There isn't anything right now to do that. I think you could probably solve that a couple different ways, but I think it is a really interesting idea, for sure.
All right, so you mentioned that we all have dependencies which are kind of outside of our purview, and some of these are like Git or perhaps a cloud provider is down or S3. That would be horrible, but it's happened.
Absolutely.
So Key Vault is something that we've had, or something along those lines. How would this kind of graphic capture those outside edge dependencies so that we would know that they're down, and then we could visualize what services they affect directly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've tackled that a little differently here. Within operational readiness, what we're starting to do is track third-party services. So a great example is S3. Like, the worst feeling in the world is thinking that you need to go to a whiteboard and remember all of the services you think use S3 when S3 is down. Like, that, how terrible of a feeling would that be, right? So we're really motivated to make sure we have something queryable for that type of thing. And then at the point that you have that, or at the point that you have the ability to assess like what are all the things dependent on the service, then it makes sense for you to figure out how you have some sort of health metric that represents that service. So for us, we've looked more at back in those automation functions. If an incident triggers for your stack and your stack depends on S3 or CloudFront or like any other, whatever cloud you're in, some of the services, then you could write automation for either listening to the alert information or listening to the incident information that does health tests against those services and post back to the incident or post back to the alert. By the way, S3 is healthy. By the way, your database is healthy. By the way, secret storage is healthy, GitHub's healthy, whatever it is, right? So our thoughts are it's probably more important right now to start thinking about how do we capture what those dependencies are, and then as we go, we'll start to figure out how we build automation to worry about if they're healthy or not later. Because for the most part, a lot of those service providers are typically more available than like any one specific node in your stack or something like that. So in terms of where we spend our energy, that's more around awareness than visualization of it.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm just kind of curious. I'm trying to get my head around this graph. So I'm assuming nothing ever fails, right? So what would it
here's a failure right there, red.
Well, that's what I'm trying. So is something being put on a queue and then it receives it? So I'm just trying to understand what this is representing. So something's sending something. So does it put it in a queue and then when it gets to the other end, it says, "Oh, I've received you." I'm just trying to understand these dots and what they mean.
Sure. So there are different representations. So it's hard to show when we've abstracted away some of the aspects of things. So for example, service mix service face is a queue that Mario is reading from. In this case, Huey, Dewey, and Louie are endpoints that Mario is pushing requests to, and you'll see yellow and red here. So those are actually representing, yellow is basically an error that we were still able to complete through, and red it would be like a 404 or something that like you can't push through. So there are absolutely nodes on here that represent a queue, and there are things in here that represent a service. So some of what we've been able to do, I know you're probably not going to be able to see this really well, but you can push metadata into here too. So like on Mario, we were able to push like what the average duration of the request rate is right here. So like Mario is an app doing something, whereas I didn't get it built into this one in time, but like service mix service face, you could push like queue depth, right? Because it's a queue, so you could say, hey, there's 200 available messages here right now, or this is the average age of a message. So those are absolutely things to connect back to Bridget's earlier question, like age of messages on a queue. If they get to be over like a minute or two, we care, right? So we could mark that yellow, and that would help us think, ooh, maybe Mario's not reading something off service mix service face. Fast enough. What's that? You let Reddit vote on that one. No, I let my dear friend and neighbor. When I ran out of ideas, I kept asking Mike. I was like, "Throw me a name." A name, service mix service face.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Okay, just checking to see if we have any more questions. We have one more question. All right, here we go.
Apologies to anyone who's not fascinated by this visualization, because that's where the questions come from. More questions about the dots. Why is the velocity of some dots higher than the others where they pass them? Is that a representation of priority?
Yeah, it's actually really important to just not get too hung up. That's all buried in the algorithm of the Netflix open source program there. So that each dot itself doesn't represent an individual message. It's an overall representation of all of the messages available. So it's not really something that we dug into too much. We tried to keep the core of the Visceral project at the state it was for now. We would love to contribute back to it at some point here in the future, but for now it's just kind of what the visualization layer had in it.
So getting away from the nitty gritty of your really cool visualization and sort of back to the overall of your talk, but still staying on the visualization. How closely does this visualization model your org chart? And have you thought about making a similar visualization for, say, inter-team communications?
Yeah, so I think we have a great awareness for Conway's Law at SPS, and I think we've done a lot to avoid it, or at least like influence it in the proper ways. I think for sure Mario represents my email inbox, but Neo is definitely Bridget's, and I think that overall at SPS, what we really worry more about is trust and accountability in our service teams. So as long as we figure out how to consistently maintain a level of awareness and a level of context about the services being built, like we trust everybody. We're all trying to do great things. We want to make sure we have the right platforms in place to allow people to work on differentiating code instead of non-differentiating code. And anything we can do like this that brings interesting data with a platform that lets you be part of it. This represents I'm swinging from the hip. Probably 7 or 8 different service teams work here, and so there's a lot of different org structures represented within this. And that's the dev teams, right? There's ops and security and red teams that are trying to bring us down and all that kind of stuff along the way.
To make you safer.
Darn right.
All right. I think that we should probably call it here, but we're going to be hypnotized by this graph indefinitely. You're going to turn this into a GIF and put it on the internet so we can watch it on a loop, right?
That's a great idea.
Nice.
If you have recommendation, I thought for a long time about turning this into like some really funny like journey story about how Buffy talks to Angel, and then
I'm focused on the part down there with the Packers and the Vikings.
Yeah.
So. All right. Well, anyway, please give it up for Andy Domeier.
Thank you.